Day 157 to 6:11 p.m. Mount Malabido, General Nakar, province of Quezon. Being capable of flight sure had its advantages. While everyone was bracing the violent shaking of earth, screaming and enveloped in fear, Mark and May, instead, were watching a spectacular scene from the sky. Mark and May watched the terrifying tremors on the ground. Everything was shaking, even mountains as if they were small trees rooted in unstable soil. The two watched mountains moving as if they were living giants. The base of the mountains was torn apart, forming unfathomably deep cliffs and crevices. Only to get filled with soil and rocks, once more, appearing from thin air with a whisk of bright light. Those narrow and shallow rivers widened and deepened. Lakes turned into small seas. New trees also appeared, along with animals that did not exist in the mortal dimension before. The familiar structures in the spirit dimension popped out of nowhere, along with everyone alive inside them. Even the sky was changing as the cracks slowly vanished. The sky was never this blue, even after the apocalypse started. Mark and May were watching the birth of a new Earth. It was a once-in-a-lifetime scene that most people on Earth had no way of seeing. Nonetheless, the Earth's change did not only give birth to the new. It also brought destruction to the old. Most of the things humans and other races created and existed before in both worlds were destroyed. Cities and towns that survived the reign of hell turned into ruins. It was even worse for man-made structures. There was no way any building created by humans would withstand an earthquake with a magnitude higher than 10. Even buildings inside settlements protected by barriers collapsed, causing a massive amount of deaths among the survivors. The barriers might have protected everyone from the dangers outside. But the dangers from within were a different issue. Even if the eyes wanted to protect humanity from an outside threat, natural disasters were not something they could put their hands into. Yes, the current change, the fusion of different dimensions on Earth, was considered by the world as a natural disaster. It was an inevitable event that would happen due to Earth's current situation. As the change progressed, Mark and May were actually worried about their base. But unexpectedly, it barely felt the brunt of the earthquake. The earthquake sure was not a regular one. An earthquake would usually last a few seconds to a few minutes. Of course, not including unusual ones like the earthquake in Sumatra, Indonesia, in 1861, which lasted 32 years. The earthquake that was the result of Earth changing its topography lasted for about 3 hours. It was already sunset when the changes began to stop. After even a whole hour of the earthquake, something that demolished cities in a few seconds, the base stood still. And it remained safe even after Earth's change finished. This made Mark and May felt relieved. This is unexpected. Fourth's voice entered the two's ears. Your base escaped the world's transformation unscathed. I thought there would at least be a few buildings collapsing. You guys did some preparations, didn't you? The two turned to Fourth, only to see her weakened state. She behaved the same, but her body was as transparent as a ghost. Sensing the stares, Fourth shrugged. Don't mind my state. It's a small price to pay, considering we had to stop Earth from destruction. Fourth explained. I'll recover in the future. Considering how many humans are left and if it did not decrease too drastically anymore, it'll probably take about 100 years or so. That made Mark wince. 100 years was too long. Stop staring at me pitifully. Fourth complained. Quick. Tell me, how did you manage to pull it off? Of course, Fourth was interested. The whole world was devastated except for places where powerful beings resided. Yet, Mark's base, where only a few hundred humans lived, managed to remain unscathed. And to Fourth's question, Mark answered. Not telling. That answer made Fourth pout in displeasure. Even if she looked like a beautiful lady, Fourth still behaved like a child. I'll ask 19th instead. It was just a gamble. That was why Mark did not want to say it. For the base to avoid the earthquake, there were two cards that Mark put into play. First was Chio, the night-evered spirit tree. Her roots already had consolidated the entire Mount Malabido. Because of it, it would be harder for natural disasters to deform the whole mountain. It would also stop landslides from happening and even nourish the land around it slowly. The second card was no other than Lewis Morgan, the inheritor of geokinesis, psychic ability. Mark had not had a proper talk with the guy yet and only gave him an order for now. That order was to use his psychic ability to keep the land around the base intact. With his current level, it would be hard to do it for the whole 3 hours. However, Mark had given all his Earth attribute crystals to the guy. Mark did not have many of it, but it was something that he did not lack. They managed to pull it off because of these 2 cards, leaving the base as even if almost everything in the world was destroyed. Mark looked around and noticed that the barrier that Fourth created was still up. What about that? Mark pointed at the barrier in the sky. Want me to remove it? Fourth asked with a smug look. I'm just asking. Mark did not mind her trying to take advantage of the question and just turned away uninterested. Seeing that move by Mark, however, Fourth pouted even more and explained. HMMPH. The barriers around every place on Earth with surviving humans would be up for about another month. Fourth harumphed. It's to allow them the opportunity to prepare and rebuild as things would soon get even more dangerous. Remember, those space debris are not the only threat. The danger is what those chunks of metal carried. Besides, Fourth added as she turned her head towards the sky. Not all the debris had already fallen. As Fourth said those words, they saw a streak of red light in the sky as another flaming debris flew above their heads. It was not a surprising thing. Given that the gigantic planetary debris exploded in space, not all its fragments would fall into Earth immediately. Many of the chunks of planetary debris would float and orbit around Earth for some time before being pulled by Earth's gravity. This meant that the reign of hell had not truly ended. From time to time, a chunk of planetary debris would enter Earth and cause massive destruction. However, that was not all. The actual threat was not those chunks of space debris but the thing they carried. It was the second pathogen that entered Earth through space. The Mechid pathogen. Not much was known about it and its effects on Earth. Would this new pathogen create another army of creatures that would threaten humanity? Would they work hand in hand with those infected with mutagen? There were a whole lot of questions to ask, and there was no answer to find at the moment. You two better go home and start your preparations. Fourth spoke the two in a serious tone. Who knows when those machine creatures would appear outside your doorsteps. I'll also have to return too. And with those words, Fourth flew off, vanishing from the sight of Mark and May. The expression of the two was quite serious too. The change of Earth was not the end. It was just the beginning of a new struggle for survival. Day 156 to 7:25 a.m. Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. While the rest of the world had the chance to rebuild and prepare, South America was already going on its last stand. Without an eye to protect them, more than half of the continent turned into a dead man's land. Seawater flooded a large part of the continent, sinking coastal areas to the ocean floor. Even the fusion of dimensions did not help, as those places were swallowed by the ocean before it happened. As there were no barriers created in any part of South America, whole chunks of space debris crashed to the ground. The largest ones were a size of a skyscraper, flattening an entire city into a deep crater. Day 156 to 7:31 a.m. Amazon rainforest, state of Amazonas, Brazil. Many places in South America faced the same fate. Even the Amazon was not spared. The wet and cold rainforest was already enveloped in flames. At the center of the forest was another crater with towering space debris at its center. It was the largest chunk of space debris that crashed into Earth without any hindrance. Although the fusion of dimensions filled some parts of the crater with a new land, the destruction that the crash left was still visible for everyone to see. The worst thing, however, was not only that the space debris landed intact. Its so-called passengers managed to survive as well for the most part. Yes, most part. Clank. Bam. A large part of the planetary debris fell off, causing a loud crash. It revealed a hollow interior on the space debris. And there, stepping under the light of the sun for the first time, was a creature with 4 legs. Was it an organic monster? A destructive robot? It was hard to say with just a glance. A creature with 4 metallic legs and a humanoid upper body composed of pulsating flesh. As it stepped through the door of its hollow, dark prison, its red, bulged right eye scanned the surroundings. The rotation of its eye revealed wirings behind its eyeballs, covered in greenish rotting flesh. Spurt. Its left eye just spewed black goo with a strong smell of infectious pus. The creature staggered, showing that the crash also caused damage to its horrendous body. The creature stared at the burning forest. Living trees blanketed in flames. It was the first time this creature living in space had seen such a scene. Clank. Creak. Slowly, one step at a time, it moved out of its prison. Clank. Bam. The creature fell. It did not realize that the door it opened was far above the ground. Staggering, it slowly lifted its body up. Clank. One of its 4 limbs fell. The fall did more damage to its already broken robotic body. But the damage did not deter the creature. Using its 3 remaining legs, it moved forward, scanning the surroundings. It approached the burning forest. The curiosity in its eyes was clear. One step at a time, it advanced. Until its rotting body felt the scorching heat that it stopped. As its receptors received the heat. Kruak. It roared in pain as it hurriedly retreated. Its robotic voice echoed into the surroundings. The pain transmitted was perceived as a danger. The creature looked around. The crater was surrounded by a burning forest. CRROOOAARRRR. The creature roared, thinking that it was surrounded by a danger that it could not face alone. And as it did, clank, clank, bam, clank, bam, bam. Countless pieces of the planetary debris fell off, each one revealing a hollow interior. Some appeared to be rooms, while others looked like hallways. The appearance of the interior was the least to be concerned about, however. As pieces of the planetary debris fell like it was being shaved off, one after another, rotting creatures, half metallic and half organic, stepped out of their space prison. All of them appeared to be damaged. Some of the creatures pulled their hind legs as their wiring released sparks. Others dragged their bodies with their hands on the floor with their entire lower body smashed to pieces. They all observed the new world they crashed into, a planet that was totally unfamiliar to them. The planet that they would conquer soon. Seeing its allies come out of their prison, the first creature tried to move forward. It staggered and fell to the ground. As it stood up once more, it looked at its broken leg. It knew that it needed to find something that could replace its leg soon. It did not matter whether it be a machine or an organic limb. Volume 12 End. Day 160 to 11:21 a.m. Agos River, General Nakar, Province of Quezon. It was already 3 days after the consecutive events that changed the entire world. Gliding down from the sky, Mark landed on a large rock by the riverside. After a long while, Mark stepped on this river area by at the base of Mount Malabido once more. When was the last time he went around its vicinity? It should be at that time when Mark and Amihan made their way to real military settlement, just before encountering Colleen and Alana's group for the first time. But to say, the appearance of the river, then and now, drastically differed. The current Agos River had its width doubled. The flow of the water was more violent than before. It was also quite deep at its center. And to say, it looked better than its dried appearance in the past. Of course, also more dangerous. If a regular human fell into this river by accident in its current state, there was no need to even imagine getting back up without a miracle. Many things changed in the terrain around the mountain. Even Mount Malabido had grown larger. It was troublesome since the dirt road they painstakingly created was covered with trees and grass once more, not to mention that it was a longer trek down the mountain. Sad to say, almost nothing was familiar in the surroundings anymore. The world's change definitely brought forth good and bad outcomes. With the new Earth's current landmass, overpopulation would not be an issue for the next 100 or 1,000 years. Of course, that was if humanity could repopulate the planet, considering how dangerous it was now. And the biggest problem at the moment was not the infected nor the mutated animals. Not even the mechids that had yet to make its appearance in front of Mark. It was radiation. This was something that no one had expected. It seemed that the planetary debris contained large amounts of radioactive materials inside it, which scattered across the globe. That might have to do with the power source of the artificial planet. Although the amount of radiation did not seem harmful for a short time, it was better not to take any chances. Even more so, considering that mutagen was present in everyone. It might use the radiation to do something unexpected, like mutating a perfectly healthy human into a monster. This also made Mark expect to see radioactive, mutated infected in the near future. The only place safe from the radiation was inside the barriers that the eyes created. Although humans without protection could step out of the barriers, they would soon feel nauseous. The time for the symptoms to appear would vary, but it seemed that evolvers and mutators could last longer outside. And to say, even regular humans now could stay longer under this amount of radiation compared to humans before the apocalypse. This was one of the things that proved that mutagen was capable of enhancing humans, even without being an evolver or a mutator. Another thing was that magical creatures seemed to have some immunity to the radiation. It might be surprising at first. But if one was to think about it, magical energy could also be considered a form of radiation. It might be the reason they could withstand radiation. Mark, however, had no problems going outside. Radiation was a form of energy. As a person capable of using miasma, Mark was like a fish released into the sea. Any radiation that would touch his body would be absorbed by his miasma. Not only this caused Mark to be immune, but it was also increasing his strength slowly. And that was why Mark was outside, scouting the surroundings. As for why Mark was only doing the scouting 3 days after the event, they were busy organizing the base these past few days. While the base remained intact because of Chio and Luis Morgan, it still felt the earthquake. Many things like in the warehouse got toppled. Even in houses, utensils and pieces of furniture were displaced. Luckily, the supplies stored in glass jars and bottles were not stored in the warehouse. Instead, those were all hidden inside Chio's subdimension. That was why any fragile supplies they had were safe. Many of their canned goods got dents, though. Roar. Suddenly, a mutated animal rushed roaring towards Mark. Mark already anticipated the attack as he already detected it beforehand. The animal brandished its claws towards Mark's back ferociously. Mark turned his head over his shoulder. With a swift swing of the divider, one of his whip blades, the blood of the animal splattered. Its head fell off midair. Stepping back, Mark avoided the falling body of the animal and the splatter of its blood. The body of the dead animal fell onto the rocky riverside. Mark took a look at it with a frown. It seemed to be a mutated household cat about the size of a large dog. However, its body was covered in disgusting boils, and it strongly smelled like pus. As Mark had thought, mutations because of the radiation had appeared. However, Mark was suspicious. With the amount of radiation in the surroundings, it should take more time for animals to mutate. The radiation was also dissipating as time went by. Mark did not think that it would become a crisis, especially in terms of food. Of course, radiated mutated animals would appear, but it was likely to be rare cases. Unless the mutated animal made contact with the source of radiation. It was not surprising. The broken chunks of the planetary debris were scattered everywhere. The existence of this cat might indicate that there was a radiation source nearby. Mark deduced the direction that the mutated cat came from and started to fly downstream. It did not take long, and he found the location. There, a pointed chunk of space debris was half buried in the soil. It was not hard to find. Even if the craters were filled by new soil because of the dimension fusion, the traces of destruction that the debris caused could not be erased that easily. In this case, topped trees and the broken riverside rocks. Not to mention that Mark could feel the radiation getting stronger and stronger. The blackish-gray chunk of melted metal was about the size of a small four-seater car. What Mark immediately noticed was the hollow interior of the debris. There was also the fallen part of it on the ground. This reminded Mark of scenes from video games where an alien lifeform forced its way out of its broken pod. However, it did not seem to be alive in this case. Mark could see a non-moving half-mechanical, half-organic body in front of the debris. Covering his body with miasma, Mark approached the space debris. He wanted to remove this thing from this mountain as it could spark dangerous effects from the surroundings. If left alone, it might affect his base in one way or another. First, Mark cautiously observed the dead creature on the ground. His eyes were filled with curiosity, in contradiction to the usual empty expression. Mark took out a piece of rebar from his ring. He had these kinds of things in his storage. In a zombie apocalypse, anything could happen. Who knows when he would need these things, like now. Using the rebar, Mark poked different parts of the creature's body. He even turned the body around as it seemed to be facing upside down. Although far from human, the upper body of the creature was humanoid. It seemed to have 4 legs, but Mark could see that 3 were broken in this one. Half of its head and torso were crushed, which might be the cause of its death. The more Mark observed the creature, the more he felt curious. Its exterior body was organic. However, it did not seem to be natural. It appeared to be synthetic. The skeleton, or rather, skeletal frame, was definitely made of a metal unknown to Earth. It also seemed to have blood vessels, although not made of tissue. Instead, it had something similar to clear silicon tubes accompanied by wirings. Without a doubt, it was an alien robot. Even calling it an alien android might not be wrong either. In any case, it was an artificial lifeform. This is a mechad, isn't it? Mark surmised. As far as Mark knew, the planetary debris carried no lifeform aside from mechads, if they could be considered as one. Mark wanted to study it further. However, its artificial flesh seemed to be rotting already. It was melting into black pus-smelling liquid. He did not want to carry something like this, not to mention the risk it could bring to others. Maybe I should build a laboratory or workshop, far from the base just in case. Mark murmured, considering the circumstances. Taking his attention away from the dead mechad, Mark turned to the broken space debris. The radiation was coming from this thing instead of the dead mechad. It was a relieving thing. As the cause of radiation was from the space debris, Mark cautiously poked and tapped it using the rebar in his hand. It was all made of metal. Mark murmured. And then, with all his strength, Mark swung the rebar at the space debris with both hands. Bam! Mark's hands felt numb as he let go of the rebar that was split in half. His swing was strong, but the space debris was too. The rebar did not even leave a mark on its surface and got split instead. The rest of the rebar bounced off and flew, spinning far into the distance. Just what kind of metal is this? Mark said with great interest. Even the metal matrix composites in the more advanced Aerialis were not this strong. Then, an idea entered Mark's mind as he took out a blood whip on his hand. One property of his blood was to be able to turn into metal and vice versa. Nonetheless, the base of that metal was also iron. Turning back into blood means that it was melting the iron composite and other properties of the blood metal. Mark tried it before, and his blood could melt anything that had the same component as his blood. Iron, for example. It was just until now, Mark had not found any use for this thing. If this space debris had iron in its makeup, Mark might be able to melt it. Of course, he would not dare absorb it in his body. He was not foolish. And as Mark thought, the metal composite of this space debris had iron. It was too little, though, as he could only leave a few marks on the surface. Nonetheless, it made Mark capable of dismantling this thing. It was rather slow, though. While his blood could melt blood metal fast, other metals were far different. It was even slower on this absurdly strong metal. Mark did not give up, however. Even if it took him days, he would dismantle this thing. Fortunately, Mark only had to spend the rest of the day and managed to find where the radiation was leaking from. It was in a compartment inside the debris. It might have been easier to open it if not for the fact that the compartment was melted shut. It was very likely to be the result of it entering Earth's atmosphere. Creating a pair of tongs with blood metal, Mark carefully took out the radiation source. What Mark got was a glass capsule about the size and shape of an American football. Both ends had metal nodes, which made Mark think that it was some sort of battery. This is not kryptonite, right? Mark tilted his head, seeing the green glowing crystal inside the capsule. It was where the radiation was coming from. The glass capsule should be able to contain the radiation. However, the capsule already had a large hole and more cracks on it, causing the radiation to escape. Even though I want to, I can't bring this home, Mark thought. But all of a sudden, another thing caught Mark's attention. It was not something or somewhere else. It was on his right wrist. The psi crystal was glowing. Day 160 to 5:32 p.m. Riverside, Agos River, base of Mount Malabito, General Nakar, province of Quezon. While Mark held the cracked capsule containing the radioactive green crystal, the psi crystal began to glow. Mark could not help but stare at the crystal embedded on his right wrist, trying to comprehend what was going on. Of course, this was not the first instance that the psi crystal glowed. The first reoccurring time was when the psi crystal was creating a mental crystal yearly ever since Mark got it. The second time was when the psi crystal reacted to a pair of mutagen stone, creating the first physical crystal that fell unto Mark's possession. The third time was when there was a heavy concentration of paranormal energy in the surroundings that the psi crystal could absorb. This situation was the fourth and new instance that the psi crystal released this kind of glow. And this glow should indicate that the psi crystal wanted to absorb this radioactive crystal. At this point, Mark started to gather and put the pieces of the puzzle. Psi pathogen, from Aerialis and Mutagen, on Earth. The psi crystal reacted the same to both pathogens with the very same origination. And right now, the psi crystal was giving out the same reaction to this radioactive green crystal. Mark looked at the capsule and then to the dead body of the half-robot, half-organic creature. So, this is a concentration of the mechid pathogen, Mark surmised. However, why was a concentration of the pathogen inside this battery-like capsule? It was also placed in a compartment filled with wirings. Anyone that saw this could tell that it was some sort of power source. No, that's definitely it, Mark murmured. As strange it might be, it was not that surprising. Weaponizing a virus or pathogen was not a new concept. Not to mention using these things as tools. Even in Aerialis, Freed and Keeper used the mental crystals as the power source to the things they called psi weapons. The crystal converter that Mark managed to recreate was one of such things. Here on Earth, the scientists were also trying to use mutagen stones for scientific purposes. For example, the regeneration medicine from the already destroyed real military settlement. This capsule that Mark found might be created by the survivors in CS-11, trying to harness this crystal as a power source. And by the looks of it, they succeeded. Mark stepped back, looking at the space debris in front of him. This might be a broken part of a space pod or something. It was a reasonable assumption. There was no way that a small compartment like this would be a power station of a big spaceship. It was even more impossible for it to become the artificial planet's main power grid. Unfortunately, Mark could only assume. The hollow interior of the space debris in front of him was mangled to an unrecognizable degree. Even the compartment where the capsule was installed would be hard to find if Mark did not melt it off. While Mark was thinking, the glow that the psi crystal exuded blinked several times. It's getting impatient, Mark sighed. All right, here you go. Mark them shattered the capsule. The green crystal inside then flew towards the psi crystal, and was absorbed into it. That scene made Mark even more sure that the green crystal might be a high concentration of the mechid pathogen. It was absorbed into the psi crystal, without resistance, pretty much like a mutagen stone. After absorbing the crystal, the light on the psi crystal waned and brightened at fixed intervals. Without a doubt, it was doing something to the green crystal. In any case, Mark could only shrug. As time went by, the psi crystal was getting more and more complex. Even back in Aerialis, it was showing faint signs of sentience. It was rather strange since even Keeper, the person that created the psi crystal with her psychic ability, did not know why or how it happened. She just knew that it seemed to have a mind of its own, even capable of choosing its master. Well, it was not like it was the only time Mark saw a crystal that had sentience. Both the oracle ability of the tribe's elder and the Stormcaller crystal from the king of merpeople seemed capable of choosing their owners. In any case, the dead were already roaming the earth. There were also the magical races. And now, the mechanical zombies appeared. It was not strange to see a magical ability choosing its owner. It looks like it will take time, Mark said, watching the psi crystal. It gave out the same feeling when it absorbed the demon in Cebu several days ago. I wonder if this thing had a crystal. Mark turned to the dead body. Nonetheless, he was also skeptical, even though he was the one that said it. The psi crystal did not react to the dead body, after all. At this point, Mark was already thinking of going home. It was almost dark already. It was enough scouting for today, considering he got a good find. However, Mark frowned as he suddenly turned his head to the side. It was a feeling as if someone or something was watching him. As someone with heightened senses, Mark knew that there was no mistaking it. However, he could not detect anything, well, anything alive. Mark was already thinking that it was an infected. After all, Mark could not detect them unless they were highly mutated and started to form consciousness or if they were monarch types. As Mark got ready to fight, a shadow rushed at him from behind. Mark immediately sidestepped, avoiding the four-legged creature that was as large as an adult lion. After missing its target, the creature stopped a few meters away from Mark. It turned around, staring at Mark as if it was studying him. On the other side, Mark also managed to take a good look at his assailant. And after seeing the creature, even Mark was supposed to be emotionless, he felt a genuine surprise as he frowned deeper. What stood in front of Mark was a giant dog. By what it looked like, it should be a mutated Labrador. What made Mark frown was the round metallic thing latched onto its head like a headcrab. From that thing, several metal tubes extended, pierced on different parts of the dog's body. There was no need to speculate. Given its appearance, that metal thing should be controlling the dog, considering its behavior that was far different from normal. Besides, that dog was already dead. Mark could not feel any sign of consciousness from it. It did not seem to be an infected either. For something like this to exist, it definitely had something to do with the mechids. Mark took out his sword whips, getting ready to eliminate whatever creature this was in front of him. But then, the dog did an unexpected action. As Mark readied for the next attack, the dog turned tail and fled. Tisk. Mark clicked his tongue as he chased in pursuit. There was no way he would let this thing escape. It could be a dangerous thing. Furthermore, it definitely had the intelligence to deduce that Mark was not prey but a predator and fled without even fighting. Rushing at a fast speed, Mark immediately caught up and appeared beside the dog. Without hesitation, Mark swung his swords, intending to behead it. However, the dog jumped sidewards, avoiding Mark's slash. Then, it fled in a different direction. It was surprising. However, Mark also felt something familiar as he chased after the dog. Along with that feeling, a scene from his memories overlapped with the current situation. The dog, being capable of dodging, was one thing. However, the pattern in fled made Mark remember some things. It felt like Mark was chasing after an animal inside a game with a pre-programmed escape AI. The dog was not fleeing from Mark because it detected that he was strong. Instead, it was escaping because its preemptive attack was dodged by Mark. Furthermore, every time that Mark caught onto it, it would not continue running in one direction. Instead, it would turn in the direction that Mark was facing and continue to flee. It happened several times. If Mark positioned himself to the dog's right, it would turn left and vice versa. Strange. Mark murmured as his aim shifted to the dog's legs instead of its neck. As he murmured those words, Mark turned into a surge of black mist that blended into the shadows of the forest. The dog stopped, as it was unable to see Mark anymore. It looked around in a steady pattern, panning its head from left to right. Rather than looking, it felt more like it was scanning the surroundings. Unfortunately, the moment it stopped, its fate was sealed in the stone. PSSK. The dog lost its balance as its four legs were bisected horizontally. It seemed to be confused as it tried to kick its legs. The next thing the dog knew was Mark standing behind its helpless body. Mark, on the other hand, could only frown. Instead of blood, a black, rotten liquid that smelled like pus was flowing out of the bisected legs of the dog. It was the very same substance that was on the dead body of the mechid earlier. But then, knowing that its host was already useless, the metallic thing latched on the dog's head detached, pulling its tubes off from the dog's body. Using the tubes as limbs, it tried to run away from Mark. Unfortunately, it could not, as all it saw was a wall of black mist surrounding it. Unable to find a path out or even analyze the wall of black mist, the metallic thing circled around like a glitched NPC. Mark watched that scene, tilting his head. Whatever this thing was, it must be some robot with eye. Because of its safety program kicking in, it was not trying to rush through the wall of miasma, which was perceived to be dangerous. Seeing that the metal thing could not go anywhere, Mark turned to the body of the dog. He then shook his head. The entire area of the dog's head, from its eyes to the back of its ears, was missing. It was the part where the metallic thing was latched onto. And right now, it was oozing with the very same black liquid, along with the holes left by the tubes attached to its body. I should bring it back to study. Mark was determined to study this metal thing he caught. It could be a source of valuable information about mechids. It was one of the things they needed in order to not fight a war they knew nothing about. And thus, Mark took out a box made of blood metal from his ring. There were already 2 times that he encountered things that he wanted to bring home. One was the parasite queen that attacked real military settlement in the past. The other was the spider queen that was latched on Snow's head in Atlantic City. As such, it was reasonable that Mark prepared something like this in case there was a third time. Of course, the third time was already here. Carefully immobilizing the metal thing, he sealed it into the box to bring home with him. Mark also went back to the crash site of the space debris to take a few chunks of metal. He also took the dead mechid as a sample for experimentation. Of course, Mark would not experiment inside the base. Maybe, he would build a hut outside to avoid accidents tomorrow. And here, Mark's first day outside the barrier after the catastrophe ended. It was already dark when he got home. He immediately organized his findings so that it would be ready for everyone to know by tomorrow morning. Information exchange and distribution were crucial at this time. It was better if everyone in the base knew about what was happening outside for their own safety. Day 161 to 10:21 p.m. Mountain Base, Mount Malabito, General Nakar, Province of Quezon. The public meeting had just ended. The people, humans or not, who attended began to return to their duties. In everyone's faces, a variety of emotions could be seen. That plethora of complicated emotions was not surprising, considering the unpredictable future they had to face. All the things that Mutagen started already caused the world to collapse. And after facing the world-changing disaster, these things called mechids appeared to terrorize humans even more. The only good thing they heard was the radiation dissipating at a fast rate. And it seemed that there would not be any complications on the soil and plants due to the radiation. It was all because of the magical energy in the air cleansing the surroundings of contamination. It was a piece of good news because it would not impact their ability to grow crops. The farmers were happy to hear this, as only farming was what most of them were adept at. They might have been able to help in transporting supplies, but it was not enough for them. Only farming crops and livestock would satisfy the farmers, and it was a contribution only they could give to the base. On the other hand, hunting animals for meat in the forest was expected to become even more dangerous. Mark displayed the method he brought back yesterday for everyone to see. A thing that small could sneak on anyone and kill them without noticing it. It was very different from creatures changed by mutagen that grew bigger as they mutated. Even Mark had that thought when he caught it yesterday. The parasite queen and spider queen he caught before was actually larger than the mechid thing he decided to call mechid latcher. He derived it obviously from how it latched onto the dog's head and controlled its body. While everyone returned, Mark also went home with the people living in his house. But this time, he was accompanied by Emika's uncle, Sherville, and the scientist from Felicia's group, Ernst. The two scientists were not joining Mark's family for a meal, of course. Their destination was Mark's basement dungeon. It was not the first time for these two to go there. Since Ernst and his group arrived from America, he was already given access to the basement dungeon. As for Sherville, he was going in and out of that place since 2 days ago. There was no need to guess why Ernst and Sherville were going there. The two scientists were going into Mark's basement dungeon to study his collection. Arriving at Mark's house in the face of a cliff, May and the others went up while Mark led the two down. In the past 3 days, the basement had gotten some renovations. The jail cells and dungeon doors were now turned into observation cells. Transparent blood metal replaced the metal bars that separate the rooms and halls. Everything was evenly lighted, and there was a small office laboratory near the entrance. Of course, this office lab was not something where they could conduct large and dangerous experiments, but it was enough to test small samples of plants and animals. All the changes here followed the requests of the two scientists, considering they knew more about security and other important stuff about laboratories. Master. As they entered, a voluptuous woman greeted Mark respectfully with a tint of fear. It was Ulvela, the succubus that was the widowed ninth queen of the Black Duendas. Different from her native attire, Ulvela was wearing a lab gown, gloves, and boots. It was also by request of the two scientists, considering that she was in charge of Vem, the failed mutator, from the group of raiders in Los Pia plus or minuses who could release arousing pheromones from her body. Well, the succubus felt uncomfortable wearing human clothing at first. Nonetheless, the most important thing inside a laboratory or anything that contained dangerous materials or creatures was safety. Even as a demon, Ulvela's previous skimpy succubus clothing was not even as safe as wearing casual clothes. As for her standing, Ulvela already gained the freedom to at least roam around the base. Ulvela herself had grown accustomed to this place and had no intention of leaving at all. Given that the Black Duendas and their plan to attack the stone fortress had failed, her return would likely cost her her own life. Besides, while Ulvela lacked authority in this place, she had more freedom here as a prisoner than a being queen in the kingdom of Black Duendas. Being a queen, not to mention a conspirator against the other magical races, held a whole lot of responsibility. Here, the only thing she needed to do was take care of Vem and teach her slowly. It was hard. However, as Vem learned things, she could not help but feel a sense of accomplishment. Something that she did not experience while being a political tool of the demons. At Ulvela's greeting, Mark nodded. He could only commend this woman's efforts. The current Vem was now able to control her pheromones to some extent. In fact, if she could not, Mark would not allow the two scientists to enter the basement in the first place. Of course, Vem's control was not too reliable. She would stop releasing that pheromone if she could not see any males. It was different if she saw one, though. Even towards Mark, Vem was still the embodiment of lust as she would try to use her pheromones and seduce him. It never worked, though, and she would end up being tied up for Olvella to handle. That was why right now, Vem was locked up in a cell where she would not be able to see anyone aside from Olvella. Aside from Mark, Olvella tried to greet Ernst and Sherville. The three had seen each other ever since they were allowed to enter this place. Unfortunately, the two returned the greeting with a nod before going straight to the office laboratory, leaving the succubus pouting. I feel like I'm just a pebble in the roadside around you three. She grumbled. Mark only shrugged before going to another cell. There, he placed the case containing the Mechad Latcher. Right now, it was sealed in a transparent blood metal container. After all, there was no way he would show this to everyone unsecured. Bam! Bam! Even now, the Mechad Latcher was trying its best to break its transparent cage. Unfortunately, it was not glass but an extremely dense metal. All it could do was leave faint scratches inside its container. Aside from the case, the Mechad Latcher also had its own room, doubling the security. There was no way that Mark would let it escape and cause havoc inside the base. I'm going. I'll leave this place to you two, Mark said to the two as he stopped by the office laboratory. As for lunch, I'll send someone to call you two. Okay, boss. We'll be fine here. No worries, Ernst replied without even looking at Mark. His attention was focused on the microscope they borrowed from the military. He was currently studying the composition of the skin of mutated animals, wanting to know the changes that occurred during the mutation. On the other hand, Sherville could not hear Mark anymore. He was a botanist and the night-evered spirit tree fascinated him a lot. He was studying its leaves at this moment and was peering through another microscope. Mark shrugged. Scientists were definitely eccentric people. At first, Mark watched the two work. However, the more he heard the two converse inside the office laboratory, the more Mark's head hurt. They always use words that even Mark did not know. Unless one was an expert in scientific research, they would not be able to catch up with the conversation of the two. That was why Mark left the two to their own studies while did some of his own research from time to time. As the leader and owner of this base, he had lots of things to do and supervise, especially in the current state of Earth. There was no way he would be able to sit down and research for a long time. As Mark went out of the basement dungeon, he was greeted by Felicia, who was waiting for him in the living room. There was only one reason she would be here. Is he awake? Mark asked. He did after we dispersed. Felicia replied. All right, let's go, Mark said as the two left the Cliff House together. As for who they were talking about, it was no other than Lewis Morgan. The idiot actually fainted again after the safety of the base was secured. It was no wonder that there was not a single damage to the base. He used up all his magical energy, even all the crystals that Mark gave, to ensure that the whole base was intact to the core. In short, Lewis overdid it. Of course, Mark was thankful for it. That was why he told Felicia to inform him immediately the moment that Lewis woke up. Mark and Felicia entered the infirmary. There, they saw Sandy helping Lewis eat a bowl of rice porridge. The guy was unconscious for another 3 days. There was no way that he was not hungry. Ah, ahem. Sir. Lewis immediately saw Mark and tried to greet him. He ended up coughing rough, however. You don't have to greet me out loud if your throat hurts, Mark spoke and turned to Felicia and Sandy. Can you two leave us alone for a bit? I have something to say to him. Felicia hesitated a bit until she saw Lewis nod his head. There, the two women left, leaving only Mark and Lewis inside the infirmary. This discussion had been delayed because of the circumstances, Mark spoke, taking the seat beside Lewis's bed. I'll answer the question you wanted to ask last time. Hearing Mark's words, Lewis nodded as he reached for the glass of water on the side table. He drank a few sips and finally spoke. I heard from Felicia. I'm the reason you saved us. Why? Is it because of my powers? Exactly. Mark nodded. The powers that you got from a crystal that fell from the sky. As Mark said those words, he let out the mental crystals he had, making Lewis's eyes turn wide. Of course, he would be surprised. Although different in color, these crystals floating around Mark were similar to the one that landed in front of him 6 years ago. The very same crystal that gave him strange powers. The powers that kept him and his group alive for a long time in Atlantic City. With things set, Mark gave the same explanation he told Nia and Alan in Bay City. Since Lewis had proven worthy of the ability he inherited, Mark told him the details without hesitation. The origin of his powers surprised Lewis. That crystal he found 6 years ago was not just a crystal containing a psychic ability. It was actually an item that carried a heavier weight than anyone would have thought. Aerialis, the struggles of the survivors because of the psi pathogen, and even the death of the previous owner of the psychic ability he currently held. Although it was hard to believe, he could tell that Mark was not lying. Since the very first time Lewis saw Mark when he returned, he had the subtle feeling of familiarity towards him. It was something odd, considering he did not know Mark at all. Now, Lewis could understand what the feeling was. It was not coming from him but the power he received. What is your goal for telling me this? Lewis hesitated as he asked. Mark, however, only shrugged. Nothing. Really. Even if I don't say anything, you will protect this place because it's also your home now. Mark then stood up and began to leave. The floating crystals returned to where they came from. But before stepping out of the door, he turned and said, you passed the criterion and deserved to wield that power. And because of that, I told you its origin because someone did not want his precious comrades to be forgotten. Leaving those mysterious words, Mark opened the door and left. Day 161 to 1:22 p.m. Warehouse, Mountain Base, Mount Malabido, General Nakar, Quezon. After lunch, Mark made his way to various areas of the base. While Mark left most of the management in the base to Odalina and Huey, he was still the leader. He had responsibilities that he should, at least, fulfill now and then. It was definitely one of the reasons why Mark did not plan to become a leader from the start. However, to survive in this apocalypse and remain self-sufficient, being alone, and even leading a small group, would not suffice. Even if he knew many things that he could use to survive, there was no denying that he lacked the expertise. And thus, it led to him not only being a leader of a group but a whole settlement. The good thing was that he was able to choose who could join and who could not. He was not running a charity. And it was not a place for people to cause trouble in. Only those he deemed capable, worthy, and could be of use could live in this place. And as such, Mark managed to create a thriving community in the apocalypse. Boss, good afternoon. Greetings came towards Mark from everyone he passed by. Respect, gratefulness, and even fear could be felt from them. Respect for he had power. Gratefulness for letting them live in this safe place. And fear for Mark since a single word from him could banish them away. There was no need to mention that almost everyone here in the base knew how ruthless Mark could be to his enemies. Mark entered the warehouse. This time, he was going to check the supplies everyone gathered. The moment he entered, Mark saw the busy people organizing everything. The one in the lead was Darren Bryce Salvador, the head of the Salvador family. One of the three leading families in the already destroyed Eastport settlement in Infanta. Being a businessman back before the apocalypse, organizing the supplies, recording the inventory, and overseeing the process was a responsibility tasked to Darren. His helpers were no other than his two sons. As for his daughter, Annika, she was on another task more suitable for her abilities. Mark. Darren greeted Mark with a smile. His authority here was not as high compared to when he was in Eastport settlement. However, it was far more peaceful here that he seemed to have gained weight, despite eating the same food as everyone. How is it? Mark asked, looking at the stacks of boxes in this not so large warehouse. Darren looked towards the stacks of boxes of supplies and replied. If we continue our current consumption, this amount of food we had in the warehouse will last for another 6 months. Less if we had water issues, but that's not existent in this place so far. That's only the food and water here, right? Mark asked. Yes. We still have 2 of the more batches inside the spirit tree. All in all, we can last for a year and a half without needing to rely upon outside sources. We would likely have more if we were not forced to leave supplies behind in Pennsylvania. Darren replied, showing regret for the supplies they all painstakingly collected but had to leave behind. Mark already heard about it. They gathered supplies in Reading, Pennsylvania, and were in the middle of moving the rest back to base. It was when they saw the UFOs leaving Earth en masse that Odalina made an immediate decision. It was a good call, actually. Things had already gotten out of hand there, even with just the infected behaving oddly. The supplies left behind might be a pity, but their lives were far more valuable. Panning his eyes towards the surroundings, Mark noticed date labels on some of the boxes and could not help but ask. The supplies don't have issues with expiration dates, right? Fortunately, no. Darren shook his head slightly. We did some initial inventory back in the warehouse in Pennsylvania. We managed to prioritize the items with longer expiry dates over those that will last shorter. That is why there is no point in going back for the supplies we left there. Most of them might have expired before we can retrieve them. Mark nodded in satisfaction. It was good that Darren and Odalina led the management of supplies while he was gone. Darren was an owner of a coconut plantation, while Odalina's husband owned a car dealership business. Both of them had experience in the field, making their work more than just being efficient. While talking with Darren for a few more details, they made their rounds inside the warehouse. It was when Mark's eyes fell on a group of young women who were making glances at him. When they saw that Mark noticed them, they nervously scurried away. What is wrong with them? They're the new ones, right? Mark frowned. Being called the new ones, those women belong to the small group of survivors from Pennsylvania. They managed to pass Odalina's few trials and were deemed worthy enough to take into the base. Of course, being brought back by Odalina and not Mark, they had a different view of him compared to the others. At Mark's question, Darren made a stifled laugh. Don't frown about things you started. Darren replied. I started. Mark was confused. Remember what you said the moment you returned here. The answer you gave the green-haired girl. Although most people here don't know what a harem is, they understand that you will not take any other woman as a mistress even in this lawless world. Moral standards are very low in these times. Many women here won't hesitate to answer yes if you want them as a mistress. Me. With this looks. Mark pointed at his face. You got to be joking. Besides, I already said that I will only have Mayor in my entire life. That's the point. Darren laughed. Many women, especially the young ones, found your answer too dreamy for the situation the world is in. Even more, since you boldly stated it in front of everyone. Now, you're the content of small talks of women in the base. Even my wife is talking about it. Saying that I should follow your steps. So, you played with women before even though you already have a wife. Mark stated with a blank look. Ahem. Darren awkwardly laughed. That's a thing of the past. I just got swayed by someone who wanted to take advantage of my money. Anyway, what about your looks? It's not bad at all. I know my face. Mark shrugged. You don't have to try hard and compliment me. At that reply, Darren shook his head. Compared to your high confidence in your strength, your self-esteem about your appearance is just as low, huh? Tisk. Mark did not reply to that and continued going their rounds around the warehouse. Amidst checking the supplies, Mark turned his head to the door. He was sure that someone came for him. Something might have happened. Mark told Darren and made his way towards the door of the warehouse. The latter also followed in concern. There, what was waiting for Mark was not a human. It was a dryad, one of the slaves that Mark chose in the stone fortress. Master, the Dryad greeted. There's a situation in the north side. The Tikbalangs were calling for you. The arrogant Dryad at the start was now showing Mark respect. The situation now and when they first met was different. She already saw Mark's strength, and spirit races highly respect the strong. I'll leave this place to you. Mark told Darren. Don't worry. Just go. Darren nodded with a smile. Let's go. Mark told the Dryad, and they made their way towards the north side of the base. The north side was the area facing towards the peak of Mount Malabido. Thus, it was not unusual that evolved animals would attack from this direction. However, with the Tikbalangs creating illusions with the help of the Dryad, those attacks were not a huge threat at all. For the Tikbalangs to call for Mark, something odd might have happened. Master. The Tikbalangs in charge of the illusion magic on the north side greeted Mark. They were standing at the border of the barrier. The illusion magic of the Tikbalangs needed to be used on forests to take full effect. The forest was outside Mark's base, and thus, the illusion was outside the barrier. However, the actual problem was, now, knocking on the barrier, watching everyone inside in full aggressiveness. It was a creature with a half-metal, half-organic body. Yes, it was an actual mechid. It was the first for everyone to see one, especially something that was moving. Mark was sure that it was a mechid, as he already saw a dead one before. However, it had slight differences. This one had a high-tech glass-like sword on its right hand while it had a mantis-like claw on the other. Using both weapons, it was banging on the barrier, staring at the Tikbalangs with its glowing reticle-like eyes. Of course, it could not enter the barrier. The barrier was made by the eyes to stop any extraterrestrial danger. The radiation from the space debris and the mechids, to be exact. But then, the issue here was apparent. The mechid in front of them passed through the illusion magic without any problem. Then, it came knocking on the barrier after seeing everyone inside. We should have expected something like this. Mark rubbed his temple at the new problem. The illusion magic of the Tikbalangs work by using the forest as a maze and hindering the victim's sense of direction, making them feel lost and walk in circles. It was not news that illusion magic was something that fiddled with the victims' minds. However, the minds of mechids, a robotic being, work differently from humans, animals, and even the infected. The minds, the brain of the mechids, were programmed artificial intelligence, hijacked by the mechid pathogen. Thus, the illusion magic that was supposed to affect a person's mind had no effect on them. To think that the first problem that Mark's base would have from the mechids was them bypassing the first line of defense without effort at all. There's only one. Mark asked the Tikbalangs. Yes. They nodded. There is only one so far. Yes, so far. It meant that there might be more in the future. What a headache. Mark sighed. Luckily, this mechid seemed to be a physical fighter. It would not be strange if some mechids began firing off lasers or flamethrowers, but it was just a sword and a scythe this time. In any case, this gave Mark the opportunity to actually capture a living mechid. Of course, Mark would make sure that it was not carrying anything radioactive if he was going to bring this in. How though? Extraterrestrial dangers were not allowed to pass through the barrier. Well, Mark found a loophole for that. In the first place, he would not be able to bring the mechid latcher back to the base if he did not find this loophole. Mark stretched his hand towards the mechid. A surge of miasma shot towards the robotic creature. It made the Tikbalangs and Dryad step back in fear. They were magical creatures and more susceptible to miasma. It was a natural fear that was hard to overcome. The miasma covered the mechid without damaging it. Surely, a contact with miasma would cause an organic thing to rot. But of course, that was if Mark did not control it. This time, Mark was using miasma to absorb any radiation from the mechid's body before bringing it inside. The mechid flailed around, taking the miasma as an unknown danger in its receptors. However, how could it hit a raw form of energy? It did not take long, and the miasma covered the entirety of the mechid. Of course, even with the miasma, it was impossible to just pull it in. Mark's miasma was not considered extraterrestrial, and it could pass back and forth the barrier without damaging it. Thus, it could not make a hole in the barrier to pull the mechid inside. In the first place, it was dangerous to make a hole in the barrier. That kind of thing was just asking for death. And thus, Mark made his move and jumped out of the barrier. The mechid was unable to see him because of the miasma, and continued to flail randomly. Mark, taking the opportunity to sneak behind the mechid, Mark touched it. To be specific, Mark made his spatial ring touch it. There, the mechid was sucked into the hole that opened in front of it. One rule about the spatial ring was that living creatures with consciousness could not be put inside. While it was impossible for Mark to put the infected inside, since even eaters was considered as a living being, it was different for mechids. There were just robots hacked by the mechid pathogen, after all. Day 161 to 2:21 p.m. Barrier North Side, Mountain Base, Mount Malabido, General Nakar, Province of Quezon. Storing the mechid inside his ring, Mark observed the scene outside the barrier. The newly appearing forest looked as normal as possible. Not just any person would notice how strong illusion magic enveloped it. It served as the base's first line of defense and something that protected it from direct confrontations against the infected and feral evolved animals. During the attack of Ouroboros' China branch, this illusion magic had been proven to be extremely useful. Half of the enemy's plans did not work because the infected they controlled ended up getting stuck within the illusion. The current issue was quite unexpected. With the Tikbalang's illusion magic ineffective towards the mechids, they better start planning to strengthen the defenses of the base. Who noticed the mechid? Mark asked. And in answer to Mark's question, the oldest of the Tikbalangs raised his hand. He was in charge of the illusion magic at the north side of the base. I sensed something moving inside the area covered with my magic. Victims of our illusion magic would end up moving unorderly and in different directions. Something moving in a straight line will immediately get our attention. I gathered everyone to take a look first, but we did not expect that it saw us through the illusion magic, and it started attacking the barrier. So, the mechid saw them first before it began to attack. The mechids were still unknown beings to anyone on Earth. Who knows if they had the same tendency as the infected, to gather around places inhabited by survivors. Was this mechid drawn to the base, or was it just a coincidence? Mark sighed with a frown. They needed to study these things as much as possible, especially their behavioral patterns. You all go back. Next time any of you sense something odd within the forest, try to check it stealthily. Don't let any of them see any of you. If it is a mechid, immediately call us. Mark ordered the Tikbalangs and the Dryad, and they all responded with a respectful yes before returning to their posts. The only one left with Mark was the Dryad. You haven't claimed the forest around the base yet? Mark asked the Dryad. Dryads were spirits of the forest. They could claim an ownerless forest and become its guardian. Previously, the Dryad already claimed the forest around the base. Unfortunately, that forest got ground into dust because of the Great One's unique powers. Thus, she needed to start anew, claiming this new forest that sprouted because of the fusion of dimensions. It was kind of surprising that a forest appeared. The other side of Mount Malabido in the spirit dimension was a barren land because of the mutated Berberoka in the former kingdom of sylphs. However, here they were. New trees out of nowhere. Mark wanted to know what happened here, but the only ones that could fill in the answers were the eyes. And after the fusion of dimensions, Mark had not seen any of them. As for Mark's question, the Dryad answered. These trees aren't normal at all. If Master looked closely, while these trees looked normal, they are not the same trees that grow here. Furthermore, these trees contain magical energy. Even at the same level with the garden where I got caught. Really? Mark turned to the forest in curiosity. I didn't really notice. They all looked like the same trees at one glance. I didn't feel the magical energy you are saying either. Well, these trees looked normal outside, but their roots and core had magical energy. It makes me feel like they all grew because of magic. It will be hard to see unless it's a dryad or another kind of forest spirit. Then, how long do you need to secure the new forest around the base? Mark asked. Sorry, Master. The dryad lowered her head. It is really hard to say. I don't want to give a duration I'm not sure I can fulfill. The vile energy in the air is also hindering me further. Mark shrugged. He was not forcing her to hurry. As long as it could be done, it was good enough. He just wanted to know when she could complete it so Mark could employ another security measure in the meantime. Once the dryad finally secured the forest around the base, there would be no need for the Tikbalangs to check any anomaly they sensed within their illusion magic. The dryad could do it without even actually going out. Furthermore, she could also see things outside the influence of the illusion magic. The dryad's abilities were the thing they needed the most this time. All right. Don't force yourself but do it as fast as possible. Mark gave his order, receiving another confirmation. Mark returned to the basement for the second time today. It made the three people inside quite surprised. In the past days, Mark was really busy managing and checking things in the base. He was also going out every other day to check the surroundings outside the barrier. It was quite unusual to see Mark 2 times going inside the basement. When they saw Mark carrying the blood children with him and making another secured cell inside the basement, the 2 scientists immediately knew what was going on. Even without leaving the base, Mark found another specimen of some sort. The 2 were not wrong as they saw a half-mechanical, half-organic creature inside the cell later on. It kept attacking the cell with its blade and claw. However, the sturdy glass-like metal only received a few scratches. This is an actual mechid? Ernst asked, staring at the odd creature. Can it be anything else aside from a mechid? Sherville answered sarcastically since the answer to that question was too obvious to ask. Ernst did not mind the sarcastic remark and was more interested in the mechid inside the cell. Want to study it? Mark asked Ernst since he looked interested. I want to. But I rather not. Unexpectedly, Ernst declined. I'm a biologist. Although these things might have organic parts, they are still robots. That belongs to the roboticists. I would rather not go out of my field even with my curiosity unless I cause something irreversible due to lack of knowledge. It's the same for me. Sherville agreed with a nod. Mark could only shrug at their answers. It was reasonable and preferable, though. Ernst was a biologist, while Sherville was a botanist. Their expertise lay in a completely different field. Studying organic creatures was very different from studying artificial ones. At most, we can record its behaviors while we are here. Ernst gave a suggestion. That's more than enough. Mark agreed. We should at least study their behaviors since do not know how their eyes were programmed to behave, even more since they are infected too. The 2 nodded at Mark's words. They might not be able to conduct a deep study about it, but observing it from the other side of the cage was more than needed. With that, Mark did another check of the cage before leaving the basement. He did not want to let that mechid out accidentally at all cost, or it could spell trouble. Leaving the basement, Mark called for Huey. Another meeting would be unnecessary. He just told Huey to relay a message to everyone. It was to not wander near the barriers since the mechids are starting to appear. Day 161 to 5:22 p.m. Mountain Base, Mount Malabito, General Nakar, Province of Quezon. At Mark's last round of checking for today, he met Major Bautista. He was walking home with Colleen and Carla. Considering that Carla was the consciousness that was born from Colleen's forced mutation, it was not wrong to say that Major Bautista got another daughter. Mark. Of course, Carla charged towards Mark, giving him a hug around his waist. Carla's mind was not too different from an infant, even if she had the learning capability of a 5-year-old child. Seeing Abigail and Miracle asking for hugs from Mark, she just went and copied it. Nonetheless, Carla could only speak a few words for now, although the first name she perfectly remembered aside from hers was Mark's. Mark patted the violet-haired girl and turned to Colleen and Major Bautista. Going home from training? Mark asked. Yeah, it just ended, Colleen complained, having less energy than usual. My legs hurt. Almost everyone in the base was just common people before the outbreak. And thus, Edward, the retired soldier due to injury, was tasked to train those people who wanted to learn. Now, with both Geronimo and Padua added to the fray, Edward got 2 assistants. Even Major Bautista joined in since there was nothing for him to do in his stay here. Hearing that complaint, Mark could not help but turn to Major Bautista, inquiring what happened. It was usual to see the trainees getting tired, but Colleen was a mutator. It was unexpected. Edward made her squat for 2 hours. Major Bautista shrugged with a helpless but also funny smile. Colleen groaned. Don't make me remember. You also didn't help me. I can't do anything about that. Major Bautista ruffled the hair of his daughter. You volunteered to join the training yourself, but you're not paying attention and even started horsing around. Mark shook his head, learning what happened. It was not surprising, considering the childish train that Colleen had. She just joined the training on a whim and ended up suffering. Major Bautista then turned to Mark. Actually, it's good that we met here. It's hard to talk to you while you are running around busily. I want to ask you about something. It's about New Infanta settlement, right? Mark asked first, knowing what the Major might want to talk about. Is it obvious? Major Bautista asked back with a bitter smile. There's really nothing you might want to ask me aside from 2 things. Mark raised his right index and middle fingers. One is New Infanta settlement. The other is about Carla. So far, Major Bautista only knew that Colleen was already cured of the uncontrollable outbursts she had after becoming a mutator, and the cure was the new consciousness being removed from her and becoming the violet-haired girl they have now. Of course, the process and everything else about how that happened were kept a secret. And since Major Bautista did not seem too interested in the process and was only glad that Colleen was cured, only the other thing was what he might want to talk about. You want me to check? Mark asked. Actually, I want to return even for a brief moment. Major Bautista sincerely spoke. I want to stay here safe with my daughters, but I also have my subordinates and friends there. I want to meet them and see how the settlement is doing right now. If it was somebody else, it would be an absurd request. The distance between the mountain base and the New Infanta settlement had more or less doubled. Furthermore, with the amount of radiation outside the barrier, regular humans would collapse before they even get to the foot of the mountain. However, Major Bautista knew that Mark and his people had means that were far away from the norm. Thus, it was not surprising for him to ask such a request. Mark tapped his chin. Actually, I'm also curious about their state right now. Can you wait for another day? I still have things to do here, so let's go together the next day after tomorrow. Good. Major Bautista nodded, glad that Mark agreed to his request. We're also going, right? Colleen suddenly interjected. Even Carla was raising her hand. Go. Me. The violet-haired girl yelled childishly. I guess there shouldn't be any problems. Mark agreed, to the 2 girls' delight. I guess I'll check how we will go there first, though. Mark remarked while considering their method for travel. Day 162 to 121 p.m. Kitchen, Cliff House, Mountain Base, General Nakar, Province of Quezon. The next day, Mark used the morning and did another survey outside the barrier. As for the afternoon, he planned to do a few more checks around the base about what else they needed to do and the state of new structures they were currently building. Then, he would prepare since he was going to New Infanta settlement with Major Bautista, Colleen, and Carla. This time, he was only going with a few people. Radiation was still a problem outside, and it would be hard to protect too many people from it at the same time. At this moment, Mark sat in front of the dining table, spending time with everyone as they had just finished lunch. Since managing the base and thinking about improvements was far too stressful, It was a good time for Mark to relax with his daughters and Odalina's children, playing a multiplayer game on their phones. Although, unlike the previous times, another two extras were playing together with them. Of course, it was Amika and Mikio, borrowing phones from Mark to join in. Amihan was also around, sitting on Miracle's shoulder, watching her play. Elise was also present. It had been this way since they returned. It was pretty noisy, but it was relaxing and fun. Mark preferred this kind of environment instead of going around talking to people and checking for problems. At this time, Spera passed by, taking the empty dishes off the dining table. Spera, wait for a second. Mark put down his phone and called for her. What is it? Need something? Spera asked, confused. Both she and Mark were awkward people in terms of talking. Even if she was now living in his house, helping with chores, and now being one of Odalina's apprentices, they barely talk about personal things. Most of the time that Mark would talk to her was when he needed her to do something. In the least, he was not ordering her like a servant. It was more like a younger sister like May wanted. Of course, she was not too childish to seek attention from Mark, unlike someone. Have you tried opening a portal in the past few days? Mark asked. Spera paused, thinking when was the last time. The last time is when we returned from Pennsylvania. I haven't really tried opening another one since there is no need to. Mark shrugged. He should have told her to constantly practice since this place was not the Ouroboros anymore. Back there, she always had to conserve her powers since it was the only thing she had and was needed there from her. Can you try opening a small one? I just want to confirm something. Confused, Spera placed the stack of dishes back on the table. Where to? Spera asked. Anywhere as long as it's outside the base. Wait, try one in New Infanta. Mark replied. It should be a piece of cake for Spera. Without any other question, she tried to open a fist-sized portal between her two hands. But then... Huh? Spera was confused. There was a fist-sized hole that indicated that the portal was created. However, it was pitch black. It was not connecting to the place Spera intended to and could not be opened. Spera thought that she made a mistake and concentrated deeper. However, the longer she tried to open the portal, the paler her face got. It was not because her magical energy was being drained drastically. She was increasingly getting nervous because her warp portal, her only value, was failing. I knew it. Mark nodded with a sigh after seeing what happened. And then... No. Why is it not working? Spera began to panic. Her emotions were still uncontrollable. Fear and frustration were apparent on her face as tears fell from her eyes. Mark turned to Spera, almost cursing. Spera continuously tried to force open a portal. The color drained from her face as both panic and exhaustion of her energy began to kick in. Spera, stop! Mark yelled, but Spera was not listening. She was having a panic attack. He immediately stood up and rushed to her, grabbing her hands and stopping her from exerting her powers further. It was like when Spera woke up with Mark taking her psychic ability away. An outburst of anxiety, thinking that she was nothing of value without it. No. No. I'm useless without it. Spera struggled. Wheel damn it. Mark groaned as his right hand glowed. He then grabbed her head, making her calm down. Unfortunately, the sudden outburst after a long while took quite a toll on her mind, and she fainted. What happened? Due to the noise, May, Odalina, and Hannah, who were in the kitchen, rushed into the dining room, only to see Mark holding onto the unconscious Spera. At the table, the children watched everything. Siegfried, Odette, and Mikio seemed concerned. Iola and Abigail were the same but looked calmer. Miracle was more curious than concerned as she did not understand what was happening. Amihan and Elise were staying quiet, but both of them were also worried. Lastly, Amika. Smelly uncle made her cry. Amika yelled out loud. Mark could only glare at the troublemaker, making her sit back on her chair quietly. Gerger. May approached Spera and checked her with concern. She was like a younger sister to her, after all. Well, it's kinda my fault, Mark admitted. Let's bring her to her room first. Mark and May brought Spera to her bedroom, leaving the others to their businesses. He then told May what happened. She can't open a portal. May asked in surprise. It's not that she can't open one. It's just not connecting to the place she intended, Mark replied. I should have explained things to her first if I knew that she will have a panic attack. Mark was thinking of what way he would bring Major Bautista back to New Infanta Settlement. The most convenient way should be Spera's portal, since there would be no need to worry about the radiation if she was able to. But as Mark expected, she could not connect the portal. It was not a problem with her psychic ability, however. The problem was the current Earth. Spera's portal could only be opened to places where she had been, or she had personally seen. She should have a clear image of the location opening the portal in the coordinate she intended. But why was that? Why does she have to see the place in person? If it was just a clear image, a picture could have worked. However, that was not the actual case. There was a reason why Spera could only open portals in places she had personally been or seen before. It was because she had to have a concrete spatial awareness of the location. Distance, magnetic field, longitude, and latitude, those sorts of things. In short, spatial awareness, albeit on a more complex level. Not everyone could take notice of such complex and hard-to-determine details. It was one of the reasons why using warp portal-related abilities was not easy to use. It was also the reason why people with no sense of direction were highly incompatible with spatial abilities. And that was what Mark meant when Spera had talent towards spatial psychic abilities. Unlike others that had to pay attention to such details, Spera could actually record such information subconsciously and open portals at the exact location she wanted. The only problem now was that Earth had changed. Although Spera remembered the direction and distance, the image of the location she had in mind was no longer there. After Earth changed, the New Infanta Settlement was more or less twice the distance from the mountain base compared to before. In its previous location, there was nothing but a forest and even a new small mountain. There was no need to mention that the places Spera saw in New Infanta Settlement were already destroyed. Thus, Spera's portal could not connect to the other side. Mark had a hunch that this would happen. There was the same issue in Arielles before. He should have explained it first before making Spera open a portal. It was such a blunder this time. You should explain it properly to her when she wakes up, May told Mark strictly. All right. Mark shrugged. He then looked at Spera. I guess I'll bring her with us tomorrow, Mark decided. That way, she would be less anxious. It will also be easier to return. You better be, May replied. You're angry? Mark asked. May hesitated. A little. Gerger is too careless this time. Sorry. Why are you sorry? Mark sighed. It's fine to be angry at me. It might be an accident, but it's my fault. Don't think that I will leave you just because you're a little angry. Geez. Mark scratched his head. Most people in his place had mental problems. Well, including himself. The rest of the day passed by. And Mark did explain what happened to Spera the moment she woke up. Hearing about the problem, Spera felt better. However, it seemed that she would not be able to sit idly while her psychic ability was unusable. When Mark told her that he would be bringing her to New Infanta Settlement with him tomorrow, she was more than willing. To her, these warp portals were her lifeline. She felt worthless without it, even if she already found a place where she could live even without it. Still, Spera's warp portal being unusable brought forth a few problems. They would not be able to go to other places unless Spera revisited them. Earth was changed and reshaped. All the things that existed before were either destroyed or displaced. It would be quite a hassle, but there was no way around it. Day 163 to 8:15 a.m. Mountain Base, General Nakar, Province of Quezon. The night passed by rather quickly. At this time early in the day, Shaflar stood at the southern gate of the base. People gathered with Mark, Spera, Major Bautista, Colleen, and Carla, at the center. The leader of the base was going on a dangerous journey once more. There was nothing wrong with everyone seeing them off. In fact, almost everyone here was scared to explore the new Earth. It was the same familiar planet but now unfamiliar to them. Dangers were everywhere, and even a short journey was arduous. They felt respect for Mark, who did not fear any danger outside. Every single time he discovered something outside that the people in the base should know, he would tell either Huey or Odalina to spread it to everyone. Or like when Mark found the Mechad Latcher, he showed it himself. Even if Mark's reason to go out this time was to bring Major Bautista and see the situation in New Infanta settlement, he would definitely bring any news back, whether it was a piece of good or bad news. In any case, everyone here was also curious about the situation outside. Was there any intact sign of civilization left? Or was it already infested by things not human? Whether they were curious or not, they had no courage to just go outside the barrier and check. They could only wait for any information that Mark would bring back. With a little bit of goodbye, Mark's group for this journey boarded Chafflar's back. Everyone stepped back as Chafflar began to flap his wings. With the surging wind from the giant wings of the dragon, they soared towards the sky. Before passing through the barrier, Mark waved his hand. Miasma formed around Chafflar. Mark only left a small window in front for them to see where they were going. And in this gap, Mark would use his new item to absorb the incoming radiation. In front of Mark, a new crystal floated. It was different from other crystals he had before as it had an entirely greenish hue. With all the preparations ready, they flew through the barrier, braving the new world outside. Day 162 to 9:03 a.m. Harvick Nature Preserve, General Nakar, province of Quezon. From Mount Malabito, a gigantic ball of black mist flew eastward and turned northeast. Of course, it was no other than Mark's group, riding Chafflar towards the direction of New Infanta settlement. Through the gap that Mark kept open in front, Spera, Colleen, and Major Bautista stared at the sceneries of the new Earth. It was no surprise to see how shocked they were as they saw it for the first time. What they were seeing was no longer the Earth they knew. The numbers of mountains in the vicinity had doubled, covered with lush forests filled with vitality. Even if Colleen and Major Bautista were not magically sensitive, they could feel the mysterious aura that these mountains exuded. They were even more surprised to see that the new appearance of the Agos River. The river that flowed from the southwest mountains of the barangay San Marcelino to the coasts at the border of General Nakar and Infanta only had about 150 meters distance in its broadest areas. Now, however, with more than 200 to even half a kilometer distance from both riverbanks, it was more or less a moving sea to anyone's eyes from the ground. What devastated the father and daughter was the sight of the only remaining traces of civilization of the past. The well-known Marikina Infanta Highway that even had two other names, Marcos Highway and Marilac Highway, was now nothing but extremely long fragmented ruins of civilization. As Earth changed, the ground shifted, causing the entire highway to separate, moving in different directions. Many parts of the road got scattered separately. Some even made large clumps of rocks as its pieces collided with each other. It was like the entire highway was a broken jigsaw puzzle, never to be pieced whole again. Far from being just broken, many parts of the highway were missing. There were places on the road entirely swallowed by the new mountains. They even saw a large part of the highway half sunk in the middle of the Agos River, more than 100 meters away from where the rest of the road was. The structures by the side of the highway, barely any could be seen, and none of them were intact. It was already lucky if they even saw a part of a wall standing. A familiar place took Colleen's attention near the riverside of the Agos River. If she was correct, that area should be where she met Mark for the first time. That was an unpleasant experience because of the situation but also a memorable one. Now, she and Alana were proud parts of Mark's group. She was also separated from Carla, giving them both a new life. Sometimes, it just needed an uncanny twist of fate to turn everything around. As they continued to look at the surroundings, the more uneasy Major Bautista became. Just with all the things they had seen so far, the change was horribly drastic. And this happened to the entire Earth. He could not help but worry about how the new Infanta settlement could hold up in this situation. Not to mention that earthquake with a strength that had never been felt before. There was also the space debris that fell onto Earth, and the new threat called Mechaids. Just how could the new Infanta settlement brave against such dangers in succession? Worried? While Major Bautista was in deep thought, Mark's voice entered his ears. The Major turned to Mark, who glanced at him above his shoulders with Carla sitting right in front. The girl requested to sit there, curiously looking at the sceneries they were passing by. How can I not be? With how much Earth changed and the sceneries of destruction in front of my eyes, there was no way that I will not worry. Major Bautista sighed. I know you're not the one to blame, and I'm thankful that you brought us to your base to ensure our safety. However, can't you even just give a subtle warning to the general that this would happen? Mark tilted his head, patting the head of Carla that was leaning on his chest. Maybe I could. The person that told us all this did not really say that we can't spread rumors or give subtle hints. Then why? Major Bautista asked. If you did, the general could have listened even to a nonchalant warning. Really? Mark was a bit unconvinced. Will he really listen to an outsider like me? You should know that just a word from an outsider will never be enough to move the entire military. You might be an outsider, but you're not just anybody. Major Bautista sighed. With how much we owe you, General Faustino won't be able to ignore your words. You think that he agreeing for you to borrow Professor Sandoval is just a fluke? It might not be a fluke, Mark replied, but he's not entirely willing either. Of course, Mark noticed that. It was exactly as Major Bautista said. They owe Mark a lot and could not just burn the bridges. And then Mark added. Then, let's say that General Faustino will listen. But you think that those crocodiles would? At Mark's words, Major Bautista paused a little. Mark had a point, after all. Currently, the military might have the ruling of the settlements. However, the power inside was not entirely theirs. The crocodiles Mark mentioned were those politicians that prioritized themselves over the masses. Not all politicians were crocodiles, of course. Nonetheless, it was those useless ones who dabble and interfere more with the things inside the settlement. It could have been reasonable to ignore them. But as politicians, they share power within the settlement. They had private armed groups, and many people look up to these men in position without even knowing what was going on. The worst part, unlike the military, politicians were experts in coercing the population. They would not need weapons. Just their words could turn an entire settlement upside down. Even if Mark did try to warn them and General Faustino took measures to prepare, there was no guarantee that those crocodiles would not interfere. One thing these crocodiles were good at was making assumptions. If General Faustino began to take measures and they learned that the reason for this was Mark's subtle warnings, they would not believe it. Instead, they would assume that the general was planning something behind their backs, causing them to make their own moves in the dark. Then, it would cause an annoying conflict within the settlement, causing more chaos than it should. And if the catastrophe happened while the settlement was in conflict, Major Bautista sighed. He could imagine a far worse situation. Mark had a concrete point. There was no need to refute. Have you taken all these into consideration? Major Bautista asked Mark, sensing that he had the same thought. Not really. Mark shrugged. But it's not hard to assume the worst, considering how those crocodiles tightly cling to their position even if the government barely exists anymore. Not to mention. Mark continued. I worked with the military several times, and those crocodiles likely knew about my strength. Yet, I never really entertained or tried to meet any of them and never had any intention to. Thus, they might take my actions in a hostile manner if I tried to interfere deeper into the settlement's business. Major Bautista shook his head. Mark was on point with that. In fact, there were several inquiries about Mark and his group already from those crocodiles he mentioned. However, the military never entertained those either, as General Faustino knew their intentions to rope Mark in. It was not likely that Mark would fall for their ploys. But he would definitely find it annoying, considering his personality. That annoyance could put a bit of crack between the military and Mark's group if things got out of hand. I guess you're right. Major Bautista conceded. For now, we already got the best case scenario. I just wish that everyone could pull it through. Mark shrugged. Major Bautista sure was a man loyal to his duties as a soldier. Well, he was also quite doting to his daughter, turning her into quite a troublesome person. Why are you looking at me like that? Colleen complained, seeing Mark glance at her. Nothing. Mark turned his head back to the front. Hey, I know it's not just nothing. Colleen grabbed his shoulder, shook Mark in a childish fit. Yep, she was a troublesome one at times. As Major Bautista made his daughter behave, Mark turned to Spera that was keeping silent. You feeling okay? Mark asked. I'm good, Spera replied. Please don't mind me. I'm focusing on etching the surroundings into my mind. Okay then. Mark shrugged. This girl sure had a fear of being deemed useless. Probably because in her whole life, she was treated as nothing but a tool. If she was not needed, her existence would be in vain. It was her trauma and mentality. Mark and May just wanted her to drop that kind of thinking now, but it would not be easy. Before, the distance between the mountain base and the new Infanta settlement was about 15 kilometers. If they were not in a hurry, it would take them about an hour of leisurely travel. At a faster pace, it would take them about 30 minutes, and about 15 if they were in a hurry. As there was no extreme emergency at hand, Mark just let Chaflar fly at his regular speed. It was also because Spera was doing her thing, etching places into her memory. Still, they were already flying for 30 minutes, and they could barely see the silhouette of civilization far in the distance. New mountains also hampered their view, making things harder to see. And after about an hour of flying, they finally found traces of civilization. Well, the previous civilization, that is. The things they saw were the traces of the towns and villages on the side of the Agos River that were within the territorial borders of General Nakar. And sure enough, everything was turned upside down. Houses and buildings were demolished. The entire farmland was engulfed by the river. There was also the beautiful scene of a Catholic church broken in half with a gigantic tree growing out of the cracks. And from here, there was the new Infanta settlement far on the other side of the Agos River. Sure enough, Major Bautista was enveloped in dismay. It was within the barrier, and the area around the settlement was mostly the same. However, the new walls everyone painstakingly built already collapsed. Almost the entirety of the settlement was laid bare to any incoming threat. The bridge on the northwest of the settlement connecting Infanta and General Nakar was gone. The only thing left was the base of the bridge on the riverside, and a large hanging piece of concrete from what was left of its pathway. In the settlement, the flimsy structures all collapsed. Even the school that the military took as their headquarters were toppled to the ground. It was not surprising, considering none of these structures were built to withstand an earthquake more powerful than the mythical magnitude 10. And at the center of the settlement, there were makeshift houses built with everything they could salvage from the ruins. A whole lot of tents were also installed, making the entire place a tent city. The worst part, the crops they were expecting to harvest in a few months. All of the farm fields turned into a wasteland with nothing but dust. Before the earthquake, the shockwave from the impact of space debris already devastated the place. And as they focused on the devastating scene, Mark's group noticed something. People seemed to be gathered near the barrier on the riverside, entangled with something threatening on the river. And as Mark watched, they saw a beam of laser shot from the water towards the soldiers. The soldiers hurriedly took cover, but one was hit, obliterating his entire arm. With the soldiers' cries, the enemy jumped out of the water. It was a mechanical shark, with its jaws wide open. It could not enter the barrier, but its laser beams seemed to be able to. With the enemy midair, the soldiers fired their guns. However, aside from a few scratches, no fatal damage was done. The shark was still there, pointing its throat towards the soldiers. And a ball of light it gathered inside its jaws. Day 162 to 10:47 a.m. Agos River Riverbank, New Infanta Settlement, Infanta, Province of Quezon. The injured soldier was down in shock while another frantically pulled him to cover. With the two out in the open, there was no way that they could avoid the next attack without another casualty.
Another? Well, yes. The morale of the soldiers was already down. They already lost 2 people without even giving the enemy any significant damage.
However, they could not just retreat. The lasers that the enemy fired could reach long distances. The walls were down, and what remained of the settlement was laid bare without cover. If they left the enemy alone, civilian casualties would not be avoidable.
Thus, they could only fight, even if they were about to lose another comrade before their eyes.
Nonetheless, they would not just go and watch. With the mechanical shark midair, they only need to give enough force to push its body away and make its attack miss. As such, the soldiers sent a volley of bullets towards the enemy. They could not do this for the first 2 soldiers that fell as they were caught off guard. However, it was the third time. There was no way that trained soldiers would not think of measures to defend. And they could only try. Bang, 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 clang, clang. Sounds of guns and metal loudly sounded as the bullets collided with the mechanical shark's body in just a second. Unfortunately, there was no damage like before. There still was no significant damage dealt on the enemy. And the worst part, while they did manage to shift its position midair, its head was actually able to lock onto its target. The mechanical shark was about to fall back to the water after the volley of bullets, but its head was still facing the wounded soldier. There was no hope. They were going to lose another comrade. They wanted to use explosives. They had grenades and even a rocket-propelled gun on standby. However, these weapons were difficult to use on fast-moving enemies, especially this mechanical shark that could dive underwater. But then, shoom! The whistling sound of air being torn apart entered the soldiers' ears. Before everyone could react, they vaguely saw a foot-long stake being driven into the mechanical shark's body with a loud bam. Only a third of the stake lodged into the mechanical shark's body. However, the force was more than enough to bash it out of midair back into the water. With a loud splash and a strong splash of water, the mechanical shark was forcefully submerged. It was still able to release its laser. However, it was fired towards the sky with nothing to hit at all. The soldiers could not help but turn to the direction that the stake seemed to have come from. And to their confusion and fear, all they saw was a ball of black smoke approaching their direction from the sky. Seeing the mysterious ball of black smoke, the only reasonable reaction the soldiers could have was to ready their weapons. But then, among the soldiers, "Isn't that?" a soldier exclaimed at the familiar black smoke. And it seemed that the leader of this squad had the same thought as he gazed at the mysterious object in the sky. "Men, focus on the robot shark. Ignore the thing in the sky for now," the squad leader shouted. "But sir," another soldier hesitated. "That shark isn't dead yet. The one in the sky should be an ally," the squad leader added. Most of the soldiers were skeptical. However, the shark was in the river in front, while the ball of black smoke was still far in the sky. Of course, the priority was the closest one, considering they could not go out of the safe border. At the sky, Mark aimed the weapon in his hands. It was a large, black-colored RPG-sized gun with a rectangular barrel aimed like a sniper rifle. "Mark, isn't that?" Major Bautista was worried about the situation below. However, he could not help but feel shocked as Mark took out his new weapon. "A railgun." Colleen finished the Major's words as it was also the first time she saw Mark use this weapon. "Pretty similar to a railgun but not the same," Mark replied, not taking his sight unto the waters below. The weapon in his hand had the name, Shadow Piercer. It was the weapon he had been planning to make for a while now through trial and error. In a sense, it was a railgun as it used magnetic fields and kinetic energy to propel the projectile at high speeds. However, it was different since it did not have any power source attached to it. Furthermore, the experimental railguns in the current needed time to charge energy before the railgun could fire the projectile. The one in Mark's hand could fire a projectile in an instant. How? Because instead of using a power source, Mark was using his black lightning to generate the magnetic field and fire the projectile at will. After all, Mark did not need to charge his ability and just release it in any amount he could possibly do. It still needs some tuning and testing, though, Mark grumbled. I'm aiming for the head, but it hit the side instead. Even though it was not Mark's intended result, it did save a life of a soldier, nonetheless. What annoyed Mark, even more, was how sturdy the body of that shark was. With the velocity and strength of the projectile he shot, it was more than enough to puncture a fully armored tank. Did all mechas have a strong body like this? Now that Mark thought about it, this was the first time he actually tried to damage the body of a mechad. In the first two encounters, all he did was capture them. Mark shook his head. Now was not the time to think about unnecessary things. He just needed to focus on shooting that mechanical shark once it showed itself once more. Everyone waited, weapons ready to fire. Unexpectedly, no mechanical shark surfaced from the river. The soldiers were also wary of the ball of black smoke. They were ready to fire towards it once it showed any sign of aggression. However, as the ball of smoke entered the safe border, the black smoke moved, being sucked into one place. That was when the true appearance of the black smoke was revealed, showing the familiar dragon that all these soldiers saw several times before. It was only then that they let down their guard and focused on the lurking threat in the raging river water. The soldiers were even more delighted when they saw Major Bautista aboard the back of the dragon. Chaflar landed quite a distance away behind the front line. As the passengers alighted, the squad leader and a few soldiers hurried to greet them. Major. Sir Mark. The squad leader saluted to the two. The squad leader also noticed the strange weapon Mark was carrying on his shoulder. He was sure that it was Mark who shot the mechanical shark and helped them. Sir Mark. Thank you for saving my subordinates earlier. The squad leader, First Lieutenant Baller, said with sincere gratitude. You don't have to thank me. Mark replied. The squad leader did not bother Mark anymore after hearing that reply. He was thankful for the help, but he knew that Mark was not someone talkative. Instead, he went to converse with Major Bautista. Mark appreciated the first lieutenant's actions. Well, it was not surprising that he somehow knew his personality. First Lieutenant Baller was the leader of the soldiers that came from Bay City. Some of them were also present here. It should also be the reason why they were familiar with Mark's miasma, despite not knowing what it was. Major, it's good to see you safe. First Lieutenant Baller said to Major Bautista. Many of us were afraid that you and the others might have died already. The mountains were the most dangerous place to be in that catastrophe. Thank goodness we are wrong. It was not an ill guess. The mountains were one of the worst places to be in a huge earthquake. Parts of the mountains could collapse and cause a landslide. In fact, many mountains around Mt. Malabido were affected by this and were reshaped. Mount Malabido was the only exception and was less damaged because of Luis Morgan doing his best. I know you're happy, but now is not the time to chat. We need to deal with the problem first. Major Bautista reprimanded the squad leader. Yes, sir. Lieutenant Baller nodded and turned his attention back to the battle. Well, the battle they were supposed to continue. Would not continue without the enemy. Be on guard. I might come out if we start slacking. Lieutenant Baller called out loud, urging everyone to keep their guards up. On the other hand, the soldier who lost his arm was now given a regeneration medicine. Although it would not regenerate his arm, it would at least lessen the pain. He was not bleeding profusely, however. The laser that cut of his arm burned the wound, leaving fewer wounds than expected. The soldiers were on high alert, all eyes on the water of the river. Mark also made his move. Ignis. As he uttered the name, Ignis, sheathed on his back, flew off, surprising some soldiers. Not all of them had seen the flying sword, after all. Ignis dove into the river. It was clear that it was searching for the shark underwater. However, After a few seconds, Mark frowned. Major, Mark called out. The shark already escaped. Those words sure surprised the soldiers. Well, Mark himself was the same. Are you sure? Major Bautista asked. There, Ignis flew out of the water and returned to Mark. Yeah, pretty sure. Mark replied. I might have given it some damage, but I did not expect it to actually flee. No, I guess, I should have expected it. Mark added with a slight shake of his head. Right, you mentioned it before. Colleen chimed in. When you showed us that latcher. You said that it tried to flee after its sneak attack missed. Mark's frown just got deeper. The mechid latcher did not seem to have great fighting capabilities. As such, its behavior to flee was not that surprising. Especially if its host was damaged. That shark, however, was a whole robotic creature. No one would really expect it to flee after getting a single damaging hit. And the worst part, there was no way to find it while it was underwater. The river was wider and deeper than before. It was basically that mechanical shark's home. In any case, we can't let it end here. First Lieutenant Baller said out loud. Spread out across the riverbank. Always move behind cover. Quick. The soldiers moved as fast as they could. That mechanical shark was too dangerous and needed to be guarded against. We'll get moving. Major Bautista told the soldiers. I need to meet the general to ask about the situation. Those words, however, caused the soldiers to show some sad expressions. There was no way that the major would not notice it. Did something happen to the general? Major Bautista could not help but have a bad foreboding. Major, First Lieutenant Baller spoke. It is better to see for yourself. Our tents are in the southern area. Sir Jones should be there, acting as the general's proxy. Major Bautista could not help but worry. He was quite close to General Faustino, after all. The two of them were direct superior and subordinate for a long time. And now, something happened to him in Major Bautista's absence. We should go. Mark tapped the major's shoulder, urging him to move. Major Bautista nodded, and they hurried towards the settlement. Considering that someone had to act as the general's proxy, he must be in a condition where he could not lead the soldiers by himself anymore. Day 162 to 11:01 a.m. New Infanta Settlement, Infanta, Province of Quezon. Major Bautista was extremely worried about the reaction of the soldiers. Thus, following the direction given by First Lieutenant Baller, they went straight to the current military encampment at the south of the settlement. I don't think that it's the worst situation yet. Mark suddenly spoke as he walked side by side with the major. If it is Jones that is standing as a proxy, it means he's still receiving orders from General Faustino. I don't think the crocodiles would allow a mercenary to replace the general to command the military. With a sigh, Major Bautista nodded. Although Mark did not seem to be trying to console him, he was stating facts. If General Faustino certainly was in an unrecoverable state, those crocodiles would be racing on which puppet would take the reins of the military. With those thoughts in mind, the group continued walking. Colleen was staying quiet this time and was not pulling any childish antics. In the least, she could read the mood of her father. On the side, Carla was curiously looking around the surroundings while holding onto Mark's hand. Chaflar followed behind the group like an obedient dog. Lastly, Spera, who was still on Chaflar's back, watched the surroundings meticulously. By the time they arrived near the clusters of tents, soldiers were already waiting for the group. In the lead was Jones Galley, who was now standing as the general's proxy. It was not surprising since Chaflar could be seen in the sky as he landed no matter where a person was in the settlement. If Chaflar appeared, Mark and his group should be there. And if they were safe, then it was also likely for the people that left with Mark the last time he came here to be the same. Seeing Major Bautista walking beside Mark, the expression of relief floated in the faces of the soldiers. It was undeniable that among the high-ranking officers of the military in this settlement, Major Bautista was the most popular. He was a good-natured soldier and a responsible superior. Not to mention that his daughter was an actress back before the apocalypse began. This fact added to his popularity even from the refugees that knew about it. Even Jones had an amicable relationship with the Major as he welcomed the latter with a brotherly hug. "Good to see you back, Alfonso," Jones said as he tapped the Major's back. "I can't say that I'm not happy too, but," Major Bautista reluctantly replied as he glanced in the destroyed surroundings of the settlement. After all, who would feel happy that everything was going fine when he left but was now destroyed when he returned? "I can't say I don't understand you. The whole settlement got toppled to the ground. Many died and got injured. But hey, look at the bright side. We are still alive," Jones replied as he let go of the Major. A positive outlook. That was what anyone needed the most in these dark times. It was not wrong to wallow in sadness and mourn the dead. But a positive outlook was what was required to continue moving forwards. "Good to see you too." Jones extended his hand towards Mark while also nodding to Colleen. With a sigh, Mark returned the gesture. He did not say anything, though, and had a grumpy look. Thinking that Mark was displeased about something, Major Bautista pushed the topic. "What about the general?" Major Bautista asked. At that question, Jones shrugged. He also did not mind Mark's attitude. It was the same every time. "Follow me," the mercenary said. They entered the settlement, or what remained of it. Before the catastrophe, the military compound was situated in the elementary school northwest of the settlement. It was to ensure that they could respond to dangers that would come from the direction of the mountains in General Nakar. Now, the military encampment was built in the southernmost area of the settlement. With the Agos River widened and deepened, the dangers from that direction lessened considerably. On the other hand, the dangers from the south grew. There was no only the infected. It was likely that the soldiers also encountered the Mekads, as the settlement was in a flat land area. And considering how the soldiers behaved as they fought the mechanical shark in the river, they did not only fight the Mekads once or twice. While walking, Colleen caught up to Mark and walked beside him. "What's wrong?" she asked. Of course, Colleen would ask. Since they arrived, Mark was oozing with a "don't talk to me" aura. His mood was still fine a few minutes ago. Even Carla was confused as she was staring at Mark, forgetting her curiosity about the surroundings. "Just don't mind me." Mark let out another sigh. Colleen became even more confused. Mark seemed to be feeling heavy for some reason. And, of course, it was not surprising that Mark's mood would become foul and heavy. It was because the entire settlement was oozing with negative emotions. This was the worst place for an empath to be going into. The negative energies that Mark was absorbing were too heavy that his trait as a mutator, erasing his emotions, was lagging behind. This atmosphere was not unexpected to a whole place devastated by a disaster. Even if many died, there were still a few thousand people living. The collective negative emotions they all had were too much for Mark to handle immediately. Furthermore, the negative emotions were continuously generated as long as the people felt remorse for their loss. The feeling was sickening. Mark's state made Colleen and even Sparrow worry. They had no idea what was going on, after all. Soon, they arrived at the largest tent in the military encampment. It was not the largest because it was the general's quarters. It was because the tent was the infirmary. Many injured soldiers lay on makeshift beds. There were even those that lacked beds. They could only lay down on sheets of wood and flattened cardboard boxes. The group entered, and Jones led them to the innermost area of the tent. There, General Faustino laid on the bed. Since a group of people entered at the same time, the general noticed them immediately. The relief on his old face was clear as he saw Major Bautista and his daughter both safe and sound. However, Major Bautista's face was the complete opposite. He was shaking as he approached the general's bed. The general seemed to be in good condition, albeit seemingly needing rest. Aside from his legs, General Faustino's left leg was all bandaged and even braced with metal sheets. It was tightly tied up from leg to foot, ensuring that it would not be moved even a little. On the other hand, right leg. The general's right leg was missing. All that was left was a bandaged stump cut about 4 inches from the pelvis. General, your legs. That was what Major Bautista first uttered upon arriving beside the general's bed. General Faustino could only sigh as he saw the dismayed face of his subordinate, no, his friend. It just happened. General Faustino sighed and shrugged. I'm just glad that I'm still alive to see you in one piece. It was the same as what Jones said before. The journey might be hard, but even if he was now handicapped, the general chose to move forwards. Just what happened? Major Bautista asked. The general had no reason to not tell the incident. Apparently, General Faustino, several military officers, and 2 squads of soldiers were outside the settlement when the catastrophe struck. Their scouts found an infected nest just a kilometer south of the settlement. They all went there to assess the situation on site before taking action. After all, the infected that could cause a nest to appear could not be taken lightly. They were already on the way back after assessing the situation. They needed to plan the attack and deal with the threat as quickly as possible. But then, the disaster struck. From the sky, metallic debris rained after the sound of an explosion. Many of the space debris rained onto their convoy. The soldiers tried their best to rush back to the settlement, trying to escape the catastrophe. However, their speed was not enough. A large piece of space debris landed not far from the road. The impact blew away the vehicles of the convoy, buffeting them with stones as fast and as strong as a sniper bullet. The military trucks were pushed to the roadside and overturned. The smaller vehicles were blown off the road, rolling and crashing on anything that blocked their paths. And General Faustino was riding on one of those small vehicles. The vehicle that General Faustino rode was thrown off to a commercial building. Then, a large piece of metal came flying from the debris, slashing through the vehicle, even causing the building to collapse. The entire 3-story building collapsed on the military vehicle. There was no way that the vehicle would remain intact with all that. Even more for those riding inside the vehicle. That piece of metal did not only slice the vehicle. It sliced off General Faustino's right leg off. It was already a good thing, considering that the 4 other people inside the vehicle got sliced through their waists. The general only managed to avoid death because he tried to jump off the vehicle immediately after it crashed, despite how disoriented his head was. Nonetheless, he still got caught by that piece of metal. The building then collapsed onto him and the vehicle. General Faustino was buried alive, bleeding to death. Luckily, one of the foundations of the building shielded the general from being crushed to death. His left leg was not lucky, however, as a concrete wall fell onto it as he tried to drag himself to safety. The general also received other injuries. His right ear was torn, and he dislocated his left arm. There was also a long gash on his back. If not for Jones, I don't know if I can still be here. General Faustino said, looking at Jones with gratitude. Jones' galley was also with the general at that time. He was only riding on a different vehicle. It was because the vehicle the general was on was for higher-ranking military officers. A super soldier would not die easily from that. He even managed to dig the general out of the rubble and carried him towards the settlement on foot. Unfortunately, the tourniquet that Jones made did not stop the bleeding of the right leg entirely. By the time they arrived, the general was already unconscious. Upon arriving in the settlement, they made preparations for emergency treatment for the general. He lost a lot of blood. They needed to stop the bleeding as soon as possible. Jones also rallied the soldiers for a rescue mission. After all, there were still injured soldiers at the site of the accident. But then, the earthquake came, destroying everything. Not only did the general's treatment got interrupted, but they were unable to conduct the rescue mission. The only good thing was that the general's life was saved, thanks to the regeneration medicine that the scientists in this settlement developed. Aside from me and Jones, everyone else in the convoy is either dead or MIA. General Faustino said with a sigh. And among the military officers in charge of this settlement, there's only you and me left, Alfonso. General Faustino added. There are only 3 officers with you that time, right? Major Bautista asked in surprise. What happened to the other 2? The earthquake took their lives, unfortunately. It was Jones that replied. They took shelter inside the school when those things fell from space. Then, the earthquake suddenly came and collapsed the school building onto them. They were just 2 of many people that got buried inside their dwellings. As such, the military, we, are in dire straits right now. General Faustino declared, panning his eyes to the scene inside the tent.